He said, "It's pretty gross, NGL," and in that single careless sentence, the man I had loved for 2 years told me everything I needed to know. I was standing in the parking lot in urgent care, 22 years old, holding a phone against my ear with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and the person I thought would burn down the world to protect me had just called me gross. Not a mistake. Not "we'll figure this out." Gross. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand how a positive test result could shatter a relationship that had survived everything, you have to understand exactly who we were before the phone rang. My name is Mara. I was 22 when this happened, working a job I mostly liked, living in a small apartment with 2 roommates, and dating a man named Damon who was 24. We'd been together for 2 years, and those 2 years had not been easy ones. We had survived a long stretch of unemployment on his side, a death in my family, a move across the city, and the kind of late-night fights that leave you hoarse and hollow, but somehow closer in the morning. I genuinely believed we had earned each other. I thought the rough patches were proof of something, that we could take a hit and still hold hands afterward. That belief is the thing that hurts the most to look back on now. I should explain something about me before I go further, because it matters. I am, by anyone's measure, careful with my health. Almost obsessively so. I test for STDs every single year, like clockwork, even when there's no reason to think anything is wrong. That habit didn't come from nowhere. Years before Damon, I had dated someone who cheated on me, and I didn't find out from him. I found out from a clinic. I found out from a phone call that turned my stomach inside out and made me feel like a stranger in my own body. So I made myself a promise after that. I would never be caught off guard again. I would know my own status better than anyone. I would protect myself because clearly no one else was going to do it for me. That promise is the reason I'm even able to tell this story with the certainty that I do. It started, of all things, with an ear infection. A boring, ordinary ear infection that had me wincing every time I turned my head, so I went to a clinic and got put on a round of antibiotics. Anyone who has a body that reacts to antibiotics the way mine does already knows where this is going. The day I finished that last pill, my body staged a protest. The classic, unmistakable signs of a yeast infection. The itching, the discomfort, the wrongness of it all. It's a tale as old as antibiotics themselves. You kill off the bad bacteria and the balance tips, and suddenly you've traded one problem for another. So I sighed, I rolled my eyes at my own luck, and I drove myself to urgent care to get it handled. When I checked in and the intake nurse went through her questions, she asked me something almost as an afterthought. "We're running a BV and yeast panel," she said, glancing up from her clipboard. "Do you want to add a full STD panel onto that while we're at it?" And I said yes without a flicker of hesitation. Of course I did. I always say yes. I hadn't had my yearly checkup with my primary care doctor yet that cycle, and here was a convenient chance to tick that box. I remember thinking, almost cheerfully, that I'd killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Handle the yeast infection, confirm I was clean like I always was, and walk out with my conscience tidy. I had been tested a full year into my relationship with Damon, and I'd come back negative for everything. So this was a formality, a routine, a box to check. They treated me for the yeast infection right there, and the medicine worked beautifully. Within a day, every symptom I'd had melted away. I felt completely normal, better than normal, actually relieved and clean and like myself again. I want to be very clear about this part because it becomes important. I never had a single symptom of anything else. Not one. I knew, in an abstract way, that chlamydia can be sneaky, that it can sit in a body silently, asymptomatic, sometimes for a long time. But I had never had so much as a twinge that didn't belong ever in my entire life. So when I left that clinic, I genuinely did not give the STD panel another thought. It was background noise. It was paperwork. Then, the next day, my phone rang. It was the urgent care calling me back, and the nurse on the line had that careful, even tone that people use when they're about to tell you something they'd rather not. "Your yeast culture came back positive, which we treated," she said. "But I'm also calling because your panel came back positive for chlamydia." For a second, the words just didn't compute. I actually said, "I'm sorry, what?" out loud, standing in my kitchen, like she'd spoken a language I didn't know. "Chlamydia." Me, the girl who tested every year. The girl who'd been negative 12 months into this exact relationship. It didn't fit anywhere in the picture of my life. It was like being told the sky had turned green. My very first instinct, and I want you to really sit with this because it tells you who I am, was not anger. It wasn't even suspicion. It was concern for Damon. My honest, immediate thought was, oh no, if I have this, then he might have it too, and he needs to get checked. That was where my mind went first. Not he cheated, not how dare he, but I need to warn him so he can take care of himself. I called him in a panic, my words tumbling over each other, telling him about the call, telling him this had to be some kind of mistake, but that just to be safe he needed to get tested too. I was frantic, but I was frantic for us, for him. And that's where everything started to go wrong. Because Damon's response to my panic was not concern. It was an accusation. Before I had even finished explaining, before I gotten the whole story out, his voice went cold and flat, and he said it couldn't possibly have come from him. So I must have done something. I must have cheated. The word landed on me like a slap. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, completely stunned, trying to explain that I hadn't, that this had to be a lab error, that I needed him to hear me. And instead of hearing me, he told me he had a movie to get to with a friend and that he'd talk to me later. And then he hung up. He hung up. On the most frightening phone call of my year, on a moment where I was begging for reassurance, he chose a movie. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't even remember deciding to sit. My legs just stopped working, and I stared at the screen of my phone where his name had been a second ago. I kept telling myself he was in shock. I was in shock after all. People say cruel things when they're blindsided. I gave him grace, the way I always gave him grace. But somewhere underneath that generosity, a small, cold voice in the back of my mind had already started whispering a question I wasn't ready to ask out loud. Here's the thing about Damon and me that makes his reaction even harder to swallow. We had talked about cheating directly, explicitly more than once. We were both cheated on in our pasts. We both carried that specific scar. And precisely because of that, we had made each other a clear promise early on. We were strictly, completely monogamous. And if there was ever any evidence of infidelity, we were done. No second chances, no, let's work through it. Done. We'd looked each other in the eye and agreed to that. So when the possibility of an STD entered the picture, we both already knew the stakes. We had built the whole architecture of our trust around this one principle. And the speed with which he turned that principle against me, the speed with which he pointed it at me instead of at himself, that was the first crack in the foundation. After he hung up, I did the only thing that made sense to me in that moment. I called my mom. My mom is the kind of woman who shows up. You call her crying, and she's grabbing her keys before you've finished the sentence. I told her everything, the test, the call, Damon's reaction, all of it. And within the hour she was at my door, jaw set, ready to take me to get a second opinion. I didn't trust the result. Every cell in my body was screaming that something was off about it. So we decided to go back to the original urgent care and ask them to retest, to confirm, to do something to make this make sense. That was a mistake of a different kind. The original urgent care was not kind to us. They were, frankly, cruel. The moment we walked in and explained that I wanted a retest because I didn't believe the result, their entire demeanor shifted to something defensive and condescending. They treated me like a child who'd been caught in a lie. They implied I was uneducated, that I was careless, that I clearly didn't understand how these things work. And then one of them, I will never forget this, looked my mother dead in the eyes and said, word for word, "You must not know your daughter then because she's positive," in front of me. To my mom, like I was a case file and not a terrified 22-year-old standing right there. My mother's face went through about 4 different colors. I had to physically guide her out of that building before she said something we couldn't take back. So we tried a second urgent care, hoping for basic human decency. We got the same wall. I explained the whole situation again, calmly, carefully, the negative test history, the lack of symptoms, my concern about a possible lab error, and the response was a shrug dressed up in scrubs. They essentially said, "What exactly do you want us to do about it? You tested positive. Just take the medication." as if a positive result was a closed door with no possibility of error behind it. As if I were being dramatic for wanting to be sure before I let a diagnosis like this detonate inside my relationship and my sense of myself. My mom, who had barely cooled down from the first place, was now fully lit again. We walked out of the second clinic with my hands shaking even harder than before, feeling like the entire medical system had decided I was guilty and the verdict was final. What would you have done in this situation? Let me know in the comments, because at that point, I genuinely did not know whether to keep fighting for the truth or just accept what two different places had told me and swallow the shame. But I'm stubborn, and my mom is more stubborn, and neither of us was ready to give up. So we drove to a third urgent care, the last one we could find in a reasonable radius. I almost didn't go in. I was so worn down by then, so braced for another round of contempt, that I sat in the passenger seat for a full minute, just breathing before I could make myself walk through the doors. And the third place changed everything. The moment we explained the situation, the triage nurse's face softened with genuine compassion. Not pity compassion. She actually looked at me like I was a person. And then the nurse practitioner came in and did something none of the others had done. She believed me. She said, plainly, "I believe you, and I think we should retest you immediately." I almost cried right there from the sheer relief of being treated like a human being who might be telling the truth. She went on to explain, in calm, clinical language, that false positives absolutely happen, that a sample can be contaminated, that mislabeling occurs more often than people think. And then she said something that made my mom and me exchange a sharp look, that the original urgent care I'd gone to was actually known in the area for sending lab samples that were mixed up or improperly labeled. Known for it. The very place that had looked my mother in the eye and told her she didn't know her own daughter. They retested me thoroughly. A urine sample and a vaginal swab, the works. And as I sat there afterward, finally being treated gently, I felt the panic in my chest loosen just slightly. Not because I had answers yet. I wouldn't have those for days. But because for the first time since that phone call, someone with medical authority had told me that my certainty about myself wasn't crazy, that it was possible to be both positive on a test and innocent in reality. I clung to that the way you cling to a railing on a staircase in the dark. And then, in the middle of all of this, my phone buzzed. It was Damon. My heart leapt. Finally, I thought, he's calling to check on me, to apologize, to ask how I'm holding up. I opened the message with trembling fingers. It said, and I'm not exaggerating, that the movie he'd just seen was amazing. That was it. That was the message. While I was sitting in a third urgent care, after being humiliated by two others, while I was waiting to find out if the foundation of my health and my relationship was real, the man I love texted me a movie review. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I've been thinking about you all day." A film critique. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding, and each time it got worse. Eventually, after some time, he did circle back to what he called the elephant in the room. But he didn't do it kindly. He launched into a defense of himself that he'd clearly been rehearsing in his head all through the previews. He kept repeating, like a mantra, that there was no way it was his fault. He said he'd been tested 5 years ago and was clean for everything. I pointed out, as gently as I could, that 5 years was a long time, and that he'd told me himself he'd been with other people in the gap between that test and meeting me. His answer floored me. He said it couldn't be from any of them, because he'd never had any symptoms. As if symptoms were the only way an infection could exist. As if the very thing I just learned, that chlamydia can sit silent in a body for years, somehow didn't apply to him. Then he reached for what he clearly thought was his trump card. He said that if the infection had come from him, it would have shown up on my test back in May of 2025, the test I'd taken a year into our relationship, the one that came back negative for everything. And on the surface, that sounds almost reasonable, doesn't it? It sounds like logic. It even gave me a flicker of hope for a second, that maybe he was right. Maybe there was a version of this where neither of us had done anything wrong. I wanted so badly to believe him. I wanted there to be an explanation that let me keep loving him without doubting him. But his behavior kept undercutting his own argument, because a man who was simply confident in his innocence doesn't behave the way he was behaving. Because in the same breath that he claimed to trust the science, he started throwing out theories that were frankly insulting. He suggested, out loud, to my face over the phone, that maybe I'd used someone else's sex toys, that maybe I'd been sharing underwear with my roommates. He was reaching into the bottom of the barrel for any explanation, no matter how absurd, that didn't require him to even consider his own history. And I remember sitting there thinking, you would rather believe I'm secretly swapping underwear with my roommates than spend 10 minutes getting yourself tested. You would rather invent a fantasy where I'm the careless one than face a simple, harmless lab appointment. The disrespect of it took my breath away. I needed to step out of the spin of it all, so I called a close friend. I'll call her Cassie. Cassie has known me for years. She knows my history, knows the ex who cheated and how badly it wrecked me, knows exactly how careful I am with my body and my health precisely because of that wound. And when I told her what was happening, she didn't hesitate for a second. She was gutted for me, not suspicious of me, gutted for me. She said, Mara, I know you. There is no version of you that does this. And hearing that from someone who'd watched me white-knuckle my way through years of careful testing meant more than I can explain. I swear, here and now, the same thing I swore to her. I did not cheat. I have never cheated. I have been almost paranoid about being safe, about being tested, about protecting myself, ever since the day the clinic told me what an ex had hidden from me. I would sooner walk into traffic than do to someone what was done to me. When Damon and I finally got on the phone for a real conversation, the long one, the one where everything came out, he said the thing that I think I'll be carrying for a long time. He told me, flatly, that he didn't fully trust me anymore. His reasoning was airtight in his own mind. He knew it couldn't have come from him, therefore it had to be me. Either I was messing around, or I'd carried the infection into the relationship from before. And both of those accusations cut in different places. The cheating accusation hurt, because it was a betrayal of everything he supposedly knew about my character. And the you carried it an accusation hurt, because it ignored the years of documentation I'd built proving I hadn't. I have been with previous partners. Yes, I'm 22, not none, but I was careful and safe with all of them, and I got tested regularly enough to know my own timeline down to the month. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every day, and trust me, the way this one lands is not where you think it's going. Because here's the piece of information that the nurse practitioner gave me that quietly demolishes Damon's entire case. I tried to explain it to him on that call, slowly, like I was laying out evidence in a courtroom. She had told me that chlamydia is not a hide-and-seek type of bacteria. If you have it and it goes untreated, you don't get a clean test and then a positive one out of nowhere. It doesn't vanish from a panel and reappear later. The bacteria stays with you, and it shows up. It doesn't clear on its own, and it doesn't dodge a properly run test. So follow the timeline with me. My test in May of 2025 came back negative. Clean. For everything. And from the moment of that negative test forward, I had been with exactly one person on this entire planet. Damon. No one else. Not once. So if my retest comes back positive, if the third clinic confirms what the first one claimed, then there is genuinely, mathematically, no way it came from me. I was clean in May. I was monogamous after May. The only variable that entered my life after that clean test was him. That's not me being vindictive. That's not me twisting facts to win an argument. That is just the arithmetic of it, laid out plainly, and it points in exactly one direction, no matter how badly I wish it pointed somewhere else. I sat with that math for a long time, alone in my room, and it made me feel something I didn't expect. Not just heartbroken, but violated. That's the word that kept surfacing. Violated. Because if this is real, then someone took my carefulness, my years of diligence, my hard-won sense of safety, and they made it meaningless without my knowledge or consent. I had done everything right. I had built a fortress around my health, and the breach didn't come from the outside world I'd been guarding against. It came from inside the walls, from the one person I'd trusted enough to let past every defense. I didn't recognize myself in that moment, and I didn't recognize him either. I looked at 2 years of memories and wondered which of them had been real. And I keep coming back to his words, because his words are the real evidence here, more than any test. When I told him I felt disgusted, that I felt dirty and frightened and violated, a partner who loved me, a partner who was innocent and equally blindsided, would have said something like, "This has to be a mistake. We'll figure it out together. I've got you." That's what I had always assumed he'd say. In the imaginary version of this scenario, I'd never thought I'd actually live. Instead, what I got was, "It's pretty gross, NGL." That's it. No worms. No fight. No solidarity. Just a man holding his nose at the woman he claimed to love, treating my fear like an inconvenience and my pain like a smell. There's a detail in all of this that complicates the timing in a strange, almost cruel way. I wasn't going to get my retest results for another 3 to 5 days, and I was about to leave on a vacation I'd already paid for, non-refundable, planned for months, the kind of trip you can't just cancel. So I was going to be standing on a beach somewhere, phone in hand, when the call came that would either confirm or overturn the worst week of my year. The nurse practitioner had even advised me not to start the antibiotics yet, because we genuinely didn't know if the diagnosis was real, and the specific medication that treats this makes your skin dangerously sensitive to sunlight. I'm already extremely light sensitive. She said the medicine could make me burn and blister far more easily, and that there was no point putting my body through that for a result we weren't even sure of. "Go," she told me gently. "Enjoy your time. Heal yourself. And prepare for whatever the results say." Prepare. Such a quiet, heavy word. So that's where I found myself, suspended. Suspended between a positive result I didn't believe and a retest I couldn't yet see. Suspended between a man I had loved for 2 years and a stranger who just called my pain gross. Suspended between the version of my future where this was all a lab error and we laughed about it someday, and the version where the math was right and I had to walk away from the life I'd been building. I packed for that vacation with a hollow feeling in my chest, folding swimsuits with hands that still hadn't fully stopped shaking, knowing that somewhere in the next 5 days, a phone call was going to find me no matter where on earth I went. Let me tell you what those days of waiting did to my mind, because the waiting was almost worse than the result could ever be. I replayed every conversation Damon and I had ever had about trust. I remembered the night, early on, when we promised each other no second chances. I remembered how solemn he'd been, how he'd talked about his own experience of being cheated on, how betrayed he'd felt. And now I held those memories up against the man who'd hung up on me to go see a movie, who'd texted me a film review, who'd accused me of swapping underwear with my roommates rather than book a 15-minute appointment. The contrast was so stark it made me dizzy. Either he was a man so terrified of the truth that he was attacking me to avoid facing it, or he was a man who genuinely, casually, did not care whether I was okay. Neither possibility was one I could build a future on. I thought, too, about the asymmetry of grace between us. I had given him grace at every turn. When he hung up, I told myself he was in shock. When he texted about the movie, I told myself maybe he didn't know what to say. When he accused me, I told myself fear makes people lash out. I kept finding doors for him to walk back through, kept leaving the porch light on, and he had given me nothing, not 1 inch of the benefit of the doubt. The very first thing he reached for, before the shock had even settled, was the assumption that I was the guilty one. He didn't even pretend to wrestle with it. And I realized that a relationship where only one person extends grace isn't a relationship. It's a slow surrender. I want to be honest about the part of me that still loved him, because pretending it wasn't there would be a lie. I did love him. I thought the world of him. We had been through genuinely hard times together and come out the other side. And we had also had real joy. Lazy Sunday mornings, inside jokes, the comfortable silence of two people who fit. Part of me looked at the math, looked at his behavior, looked at everything, and still flinched at the idea of leaving. I felt like I could walk away and be completely fine on my own. I knew that. I felt that strength in me. And at the same time, I felt gutted at the thought of actually doing it. Both things were true at once. Strength and devastation, side by side, refusing to cancel each other out. That's the part nobody warns you about, that you can know exactly what you should do and still grieve having to do it. And underneath the heartbreak, there was that quieter, harder question I'd been circling since the moment he first hung up on me. If I am 1000% certain that I didn't cheat, and I am, and if I wasn't exposed to anything from anyone in any way, and I wasn't, then what does his reaction actually tell me? Because his reaction wasn't the reaction of an innocent, blindsided partner. There was no empathy in it. There was no shock turned to tenderness. There was only defensiveness, deflection, and cruelty. And in my experience, the loudest, fastest, angriest denial often comes from the person with the most to hide. A truly innocent man doesn't need to attack. He has nothing to protect. The guilt does the shouting. Drop a comment below. Do you think they made the right call? Because in the end, after the waiting, after the vacation, after the math had settled into something I could no longer unsee, I made my choice. The retest, the relationship, the future, all of it came down to one simple realization that the nurse practitioner's words had handed me, without her even knowing it. A bacterial infection is curable. You take an antibiotic, you wait, and your body is clean again. But the way a person treats you in your most frightened, most vulnerable moment, that isn't an infection. That's a diagnosis of character. And his character, when it was finally put under the harsh light of crisis, came back positive for something no medicine can cure. I thought about couples therapy. I really did consider it. I asked myself whether this was something we could realistically work through, whether a counselor could rebuild what had cracked. But the more I sat with it, the more I understood that therapy can repair misunderstandings. It can't manufacture empathy that was never there to begin with. I wasn't dealing with a couple who'd communicated poorly. I was dealing with a man who, faced with my terror, chose a movie. Faced with my pain, called it gross. Faced with a simple test that could have proven his innocence, refused to take it and accused me instead. You can't therapy your way out of someone showing you, clearly and repeatedly, exactly how much they value you when it costs them something. So I let him go. Not in a screaming, door-slamming way. There wasn't even enough of him left in my hands to throw. I just stopped leaving the porch light on. I stopped finding doors for him to walk back through. I stopped extending the grace that had only ever flowed in one direction. And the strange thing is, the moment I did, I felt the violation in my chest start to ease. Not because the test result changed, but because I had finally stopped asking a man who'd call me gross to be the one to make me feel clean again. Here's what I learned, and it's the only piece of this I'd hand to anyone going through something like it. When a crisis hits a relationship, you find out what the relationship is actually made of. Not what it looks like on a good Sunday morning, not what it sounds like in the promises you make at the beginning, but what it's built from at the foundation. Damon and I had said all the right words about trust and monogamy and no second chances. But words are cheap until the bill comes due. And when my bill came due, when I was frightened and humiliated and begging to be believed, he showed me, in his very first reaction, that I'd been the only one carrying us the whole time. The test result, whatever it finally said, was almost beside the point. He'd already given me my answer the moment he chose a movie over my fear. I just had to be brave enough to hear it. I'm okay now. Not unscarred, but okay. I kept my promise to myself, the one I made years ago after the first time someone made me feel like a stranger in my own body. I protected myself. I got the truth, even when 3 different clinics tried to bury me in shame for asking for it. And I walked away from someone who would rather watch me drown than get his feet wet. If there's a moral here, it's this: believe people when they show you who they are in the worst moment, not the best one. The best moments are easy. Anyone can love you on a beach. It's the phone call at the worst hour, the one nobody rehearses for, that tells you the truth. And when someone fails that call so completely, the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop dialing. Guys, we're getting close to 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider it. It really helps push us toward that goal. Thanks for making this dream come true.